All right, so this is the first of we'll see how many videos where I do just a quick design take on 5th edition D&D and 5.5 games that I played a pretty significant role in creating, so I kind of know the ins and outs. And these are essentially going to be sort of critiques of where the game is right now. Sometimes people get weirded out that someone who worked in a game then like, oh, let's check my clock here. 13 years after they designed it has some like, oh, I wish maybe we had done this instead. But as it turns out, you play a game often enough, you start to see some of the shortcomings of your work. And as you learn more stuff, you get better at it. One of the challenges I see in game development, I see this all the time. Why does it take so long to make games? And why do games seem to like just get caught in these cycles where they just keep working and working without making any progress? Well, the trick to making a game is as you make a game, you get better at making the game the longer you work on it. And so you learn like, oh, like when you started, you hadn't played the game much. And as you work on it and design it and test it, you're playing it more, you're seeing more of the flaws, you're skilling up in your ability to make the game. So in that spirit, what I would say is one of my regrets about 5th edition is subclasses. So when you're designing a subclass, you have a very narrow window of power that you can work with. The vast majority of a class's like core functionality, its core mechanics that determine whether it's balanced or not, exist within the core class. And that decision made a lot of sense. You don't want to let players opt out of making a character that is meeting their basic functionality. One of the critiques I saw, well, observations I saw about 5th edition that always made me happy was this idea that it's tough to make a character that's just incompetent. The between proficiency bonus and just the sort of effectiveness baked into the core class features, even someone who's just really doesn't know what they're doing and is kind of making choices at random is going to end up with a character that can effectively basically pull their weight. Now, the player might just do random things in play, like we can't control that. But if the player engages mechanically, their character can deliver what you'd expect from their class. And I think that's a real strength of the game. The challenge is like here we are almost 13 years on, 12 years on since the release. That doesn't necessarily hold up forever because just as you're making the game you get better at it, well, as you play the game you get better at it. And as players got used to 5th edition and started to kind of solve it or start making more characters, I think we've hit a limit on what subclasses can deliver. That if you have been playing fighters for 12 years now, I don't know if you can make a subclass that can make you really excited to keep playing a fighter again. Like one thing I noticed is a lot of people, they play fighters and they just play battle masters always. And I think there's something there, and that is kind of like the direction where kind of my design is going, where the battle master is an example of saying, hey, we're going to take a mechanic in this case, the dice you get through that subclass for the fighter, and that is the fuel for then options you then pick. And I think that is a model amongst many, but one model that I'm starting to use a lot now in my class design, where when I think of a class, rather than thinking, okay, here's the core class, here's how it's going to deliver its basic power, and then here's the space for customization by a subclass, I'm stripping it down a bit more to say, here is the class's core mechanic that it's using to be powerful. So for a spellcaster, that's an obvious, that's spell slots, right? The but let's say take something like a monk and say, well, what if a monk, instead of getting, the key or whatever it's called in 5.5 and making that in a short rest resource, what if we just made it a per round resource where you just get X points to spend each round, and you can spend those points to attack, you can spend those points to defend, you can expend those points to do a more utility style thing, like maybe dash up a wall or something like that, and then balance that output saying, hey, you spent all your points on attacking. Great. Where does your damage land? Well, then looking at that and saying, okay, you're going for a real offense. I can place you at like the amount of damage I'd expect you to do, maybe like plus 10% on top of that, because you're ignoring your offense. Maybe in my design, I'm assuming, if you get 2 points, I'm expecting 1 point for attack and 1 point for defense. If you spend 2 points to attack, like your damage goes up enough where it's noticeable. But it's like the equivalent of going from like maybe a one-handed weapon to a two-handed weapon or something along those lines. And so the idea behind that then is to give the player a lot more options, because they're basically directly tapping into the class's power budget rather than having it filtered through existing class features and then trying to build options on top of those class features. The rogue is a great example to me of this, like of a class that really struggles because of subclasses. The sneak attack takes up so much of the rogue's basic damage output that that trying to add more stuff through a subclass, like you can't necessarily just add more power because you already have so much of the power in sneak attack, and then you're kind of stuck with some of these awkward things. And this is one of the mechanics I saw in 5.5, which is like, well, if you forego some amount of sneak attack damage, you can get a condition. Now, I'd argue that kind of design is has a challenge in that, okay, you're making the fight take longer because now you're doing less damage, but you're also then shutting down the monster's ability to do stuff. So now the fight's like less lethal on in both directions. And like, so I get like, and I know as part of like the 5e design thing where you have this idea, hey, you can trade damage for conditions. But I think that you kind of end up in that space because you're trying to find stuff you can cash out to give players a boost. And, in the end, kind of damage is all you can afford to give away because that's what your character class is built on. And that's something that you're trying to, access essentially through the subclass, access the core character classes benefits. Now, in the rogue's case, that's a mechanic that it does rest within the core class. But that also kind of points like that's a way in which like sometimes classes try to give you a power boost um, without messing with that core functionality and balance of the core class. Another example would be the 5e barbarian. Now this is thankfully fixed in 5.5. But the idea of getting as the berserker barbarian, hey, I can get an extra attack, but then I take exhaustion after the fight, which is, again, it's not great balance because then essentially you're saying, hey, everybody, I want to be really powerful and I'm punching above my weight. And in return, we really need to rest after this fight. Or like, this is just the thing I do at the end of the adventure when we're fighting the boss monster. Which again, to me is like, I'm not crazy about balance predicated on the game not being played or balance predicated on things take longer to do. I think that's not great for gameplay experience. It might math out, but for playing the game, it's not necessarily making the game exciting and fast moving and enjoyable. Um, so that's kind of my thought overall on subclasses and class design. That I think subclasses made sense when the game launched. They were a good tool to give some sort of safe, fenced off customization that didn't threaten the core character classes balance. But I think now, 13 years on, or 12 years, or whatever it is, a long time, the we can now sort of bring in some other ways to customize things because the collective player knowledge of the game is increased. And frankly, I think just for me is just saying like it's really a subclass doesn't have a big enough impact for I think it to really make a character feel very different after you've played the class for a while and after you've maybe tried a few different subclasses. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. I'd be curious to see what people think. I am gonna maybe put some more videos on YouTube and just maybe do some more of my general design stuff like I did back in the day. And there's a funny I'm not gonna talk about that. So I hope that's interesting. I hope it kind of spurs some thoughts in your own design. And I also on my Patreon I did a bunch of videos on designing subclasses. I think I'm gonna maybe walk through some of that stuff in video form. That was originally for 5e, but now that we have 5.5 kicking around, maybe we can update those and turn them into videos and see where that goes. So yeah, so subclasses, you a fan? Are you kind of a longtime 5e player? You feel a little burned out on them? Do you feel like the subclass changes in 5.5 were good or bad for the game? Drop a note in the comments and let me know. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.